So I'm Karen, and we're being recorded. I'm Karen Sleazer. I work at the Center for Transportation Studies at UVA. I'm going to be the on-site coordinator for all the Lunch and Learns, and today is, like I said, our very first one. So I wanted to welcome you all and introduce our speakers. We have two different topics, and our first one is virtual public engagement. I'm just going to say got it to that. So our first speaker is Lance Dougald. He's an associate principal researcher here at Virginia Transportation Research Council, which is located in Charlottesville. It actually comes up in my job quite a lot, and I always describe it as the research arm of the Virginia Department of Transportation. He's been involved in transportation research for 25 years and has over 40 research publications in traffic engineering and transportation planning. He has a master's in civil engineering from UVA and is a member of the American Society of Civil Engineers, Transportation Development Institute's Safety Committee. So I will let him take it away. Oh, excuse me. And if you didn't get a lunch, help yourself in the back. If you need a vegetarian one, there's one there. I have a spare vegetarian, and help yourself to the lunch and learn back, what are they called? Lunch boxes in the back.
Well, thank you, Karen, and I appreciate you guys coming today, and I appreciate all the people joining virtually. It's kind of appropriate that my talk will be on VDOT's virtual public engagement, and we hope you guys come away with some insight on what we do at the Research Council. But before I start, I wanted to just give a little bit of background on VTRC. I didn't know our director was coming, so if I get anything wrong, Mike, you can tell me. But interestingly, this year marks our 75th anniversary. And I haven't heard of a big party yet, but I assume that we'll have a newsletter or a pamphlet distributed. And our budget is approximately $22 million. And this comes from state and federal dollars. The bulk of it being federal, state, and planning research dollars. And the council, as you can see in the picture, we're on Edgemont Road in Charlottesville. It's actually a UVA building. We have approximately 50 full-time staff, and then with part-time students, it can be roughly 80 people. But our focus areas are planning. That's Peter and I are involved in the planning team. Environmental, traffic engineering, structures such as bridges, materials, concrete, asphalt, reinforcing steel, pavements, safety, and system operations. So those are our main focus areas at the council. And we also have 4 labs. We have an asphalt lab, a concrete lab, geotechnical lab, and a corrosion lab. So that's just a little bit on the Research Council. So how do we select projects? A lot of people ask, well, how do you know what projects you're going to work on? Each of those focus areas has research advisory committees that mostly the members are VDOT district staff, division staff, but we also have representation from other agencies in the state. We have 2 meetings per year. One is in the fall and one is in the spring. For the planning side that Peter and I are on, our research needs are developed and balloted in the spring meeting. So basically people come up with ideas. We write a research needs statement that's presented at the spring meeting. And then the members vote on those projects. And then the top ranked projects are chosen, and it depends on how many projects we have. But mostly we'll handle those with internal staff, such as me and Peter and other folks. But if we have extra money and we don't have the expertise maybe in a particular area, we'll bring in external university partners, and that will be a competitive process to get those projects. Typically our projects last, it depends on if it's a technical assistance project, which is a short-term project, or a longer-term applied research project. They last probably, technical assistance is maybe about 6 months, and then the applied research can go up to maybe 1.5 years, 2 years, it depends on the project. But the big focus we have now is implementation. We don't want our research, we do publications. Actually, I was going to show you something real quick before I step out of the way here. We do have publications. So our research projects are published, and they are available online. This is actually this will be the project I'll be talking to you about today. But the big focus is on implementation. So we don't want these reports sitting in a bookshelf gathering dust. You know, we want the work that we do to be put on the street. So that's a big part of our research. So for this particular project, virtual public engagement, it was a research needs roundtable in Richmond. We were all sitting around the table, and I don't know if you see that date there. That's kind of important because it was spring 2020, and COVID was just starting. You know, that's the pandemic just began. And I just vividly remember being about 20 feet away from each other in this room, and everybody looking really paranoid at each other, like. But that roundtable, is, you know, appropriately, virtual public engagement was brought up as a topic. And because we kind of knew we were getting into that realm where, you know, meetings, in-person meetings would not be possible. So that ironically was our last in-person meeting for about a year and a half, I think, or something like that. So we developed a research needs statement. It was balloted and ranked #1 in terms of scoring at that meeting. So the next task was to develop a research proposal where we say what we're going to do on the project, we list our tasks, and then we identify a technical review panel. And that panel is made up of district staff, division staff, and other folks from other agencies that are experts in the area. And they will help guide the project along. So we typically have meetings maybe 4 times a year or 4 times a year with them, just to give them updates. They can give us any input or feedback on our projects. And so for this particular project, we had representation from the Transportation and Mobility Planning Division, Lynchburg District, Salem District, the Communications Division, Local Assistance Division, and then every project has an FHWA monitor. And then we had representation from, we all have representation from 1 staff member at BTRC. So let's get into public involvement. The EPA defines it as any process that directly engages the public in decision-making and gives full consideration to public input in making that decision. That's the definition from EPA. And in my research, I found that there's a lot of different terms for this. There's public engagement, civic engagements, citizen participation, public participation. There's a lot of different terms that people can use to define or represent public engagement. But its genesis really began in the mid-1960s with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. And one of these programs was the Economic Opportunity Act that was established to combat poverty in America. And then this act actually created about 1,000 different community action agencies who were eligible to receive funds. And those agencies, by law, were developed and were to be developed and conducted with the maximum feasible participation from residents of the area. So that's kind of the genesis of public involvement, mid-1960s, and we are, you know, it's come a long way since then. So VDOT has its own governing manual, the public involvement manual. As you can see, this one actually was first developed in 1999, but the latest revision is November 2021. So every DOT has these types of manuals that are developed to guide practitioners. Within this document, we have different categories of public involvement. There's 3 categories. There's a citizen information meeting, and this meeting is generally, it's very informal, early in the transportation planning process, where ideas are presented to the public, very informal. Citizen participation meeting and workshops are another category where there's actually more collaboration between the citizens and government officials, and we're trying to solve transportation solutions. And this again is early in the transportation planning process. And then we have public hearings, which are much more formal meetings that occur much later in the transportation planning process. And these meetings have regulatory guidelines and have to follow the NEPA process. So much more formal type of public involvement. So for our project, the initial intent based on the research needs statement was to look at the early process in transportation planning. We wanted to look at engagement early as opposed to later with public hearings. So this was the main focus of our project. And then VDOT defines this as public engagement. So you'll hear me call it public engagement as opposed to public involvement. So what is public engagement? Typically, since it started, most of them were in person, right? I mean, they had a specific time and a place. And because it was at a specific time and place, folks had trouble attending. You have kids and daycare and et cetera, work commitments. So they're typically sparsely attended. And then they were also, for the most part, dominated by special interest groups. People that had agendas or ideas that wanted to come and give input. The representation was not what it didn't represent the whole community. And that's how we did things forever. So we just continued to do this and went on and on. But that was my sound bite. COVID came along, shut the doors, rooms went black, but we had to continue with business. We didn't stop. We had to continue to get input from the public. So here we go with the genesis of virtual public engagement. So that's my prop. And VDOT interestingly had some foresight. It was late 2019 when we procured this platform called MetroQuest. And so what MetroQuest is it's an on-demand public survey where you go to a link, you can open up the survey, and then you can basically it guides you through processes to get your input. This is an example of this was done in Charlottesville. It's a 5th Street corridor study. You have a welcome page, you have about the study, and then they give the people taking the survey street options to give input on, intersection options, and then they have a wrap-up page that typically tries to get information about the respondents. So for example, for this particular project, we're looking at street options, a no change environment where you have performance measures such as safety and comfort, congestion, environmental sustainability, economic development, and then the impacts to right of way. So this would be a no change that people could vote on versus another different design where you have 6-foot sidewalk with 12-foot multi-use path. Again, you're given the very varying degrees of performance measures and impacts. So that's just an example of one of the MetroQuest surveys that VDOT produced. So going back to our project, the purpose was to assess the state of practice of virtual engagement, and this was within VDOT and also elsewhere for other DOTs across the country. And this was a little bit kind of overwhelming because we're very early in this process. I mean, everyone was sort of in the same boat. We didn't know what to do. How do we conduct business virtually? So it was a little daunting, but over time, I think we were able to get a lot more information from other DOTs, so it was helpful. We wanted to document those lessons learned, and then the scope did not include public hearings because, again, we were focused on the early phases of transportation planning. And we did not include a comparison of engagement tools because VDOT had already done that. When we procured MetroQuest, they had already analyzed all these tools and thought that MetroQuest was probably best suited for VDOT's purposes. So the tasks were a literature review, survey of other state DOTs, VDOT districts, and MPOs. And then we wanted to analyze the data that we're getting from MetroQuest. So these are what I will go over now. Literature review. What do we want to find out? We were interested in what are the participation barriers for folks that participate? Institutional barriers. What are the DOT barriers to conduct virtual engagement? What are the outreach opportunities? How can we improve outreach? And how do we measure the effectiveness of engagement? And then we also wanted to ask about the future of public engagement and then get any information about future literature that's coming out. So virtual participation barriers, internet is one of them. Affordability, availability, and quality. If you're in rural locations or areas, you might not have access to internet, and the quality might be very poor. Technical proficiency. Can you navigate through these platforms and provide input? That's an issue. English proficiency. I mean, if you're doing a project in an area that has limited English proficiency populations, you might not get the feedback that you desire from these groups. And then literacy level is another barrier. In terms of institutional barriers, technology challenges. I mean, we saw some technology challenges here with turning this mic on and off. That's a small example, but there are larger examples. I mean, how do we present virtually to people as well as in person? I mean, and we've all seen the various, funnies out there on the news about, your Zoom, just the challenges with Zoom. You've seen those commercials. So those are challenges that we face. Staffing and knowledge. I mean, can we put together material that is appropriate to engage the public? And then a big one also is can we develop stuff, material that is non-English, and then how do we interpret those results? And then, of course, lack of outreach. How do we reach these populations? Engagement and outreach opportunities. What we found was that social media is going to be a big player in how we do outreach, and text messaging is one of them. But the main thing is how do we, one thing that we've realized with the literature is there's a big emphasis on how do we target underserved populations, because that's a big challenge. And you'll see with the data that I'll show you. And then one of the things we can also do is use census data. So I've got a little cheat sheet here. Memphis MPO, as you can see in the bottom of the slide, uses census data, and these are the boundaries of the MPO. And A is for racial and ethnic minorities, those populations. B is limited English proficiency. C is age 65 and older, which looks like a sort of a more old, that's an older area. D is poverty, low income households. E is persons with disabilities. F is persons without vehicle access, and G is persons without internet access. So the idea here is to use the data that we're getting from the Census Bureau and then kind of cater our public engagement material and outreach methods to meet these different populations. So measuring effectiveness. Again, what we want to do is we really want to focus on our outreach methods, because once we do that, we can collect the number of participants, and then we can also collect demographic information. So, for example, ethnicity, race, age, gender, income, education, employment, disability are important facets for us to get. And what this will do, if we can get that information, it kind of creates this loop where if we're not getting the demographics that we feel like we need to get, we can then adjust our outreach methods, which will then hopefully boost our number of participants. So the future of public engagement is overwhelmingly hybrid. I mean, we're doing a hybrid meeting right now where we have people in person, we have people virtually, but this is kind of the future of public engagement going forward. And then there's some NCHRP reports coming out in the future that we want to keep our eye on, because there's going to be a lot of good material about how to manage public engagement in the future. So those are coming out. They're not out yet. So some of the data from our research, the DOT survey that we conducted, the figure on the left shows all the states that responded. We had a 46% response rate, which I think is pretty good. The topics we wanted to ask about was collecting demographic information, second language material, advertising, outreach to underserved, and then any analysis of data. So some of the key takeaways, about half of those surveyed do collect demographic information. And as you can see in this figure, the majority of data collected is age, race, and gender. 3/4 do offer second language material, and the majority do use Census Bureau tools. And in terms of translation, what we found is this is something that VDOT was interested in, is how do we translate the material? This is actually 65% of those do contract out those services. 12% handle translation in-house, then 23% do a combination. But this is a big important aspect of, when we do surveys in other languages, how are we going to interpret those results? Advertising. There's a whole slew of advertising. I mean, I mentioned social media as being a big one, but if we really want to get other populations, underserved populations to help, to get involved in public engagement, there are a lot of different methods that we can use. So these are some of the interesting ones with door hangers, fact sheets, billboards. You have websites, of course. We can do changeable message boards, email blasts. You can actually do something on a water bill, advertise on a water bill. Outreach underserved is a struggle for DOTs. But what we found is that knowledge of demographics, geo-targeting social media posts, such as geo-fencing Facebook ads, following guidance that DOTs have to engage LEP populations, partnering with local officials, and then grassroots marketing, such as going to places where the public is, set up booths, go to churches, go to supermarkets. So it does take work. Analysis of data, mostly anecdotal. We do a lot of DOTs. Again, we were early in the process, but they do track page views, hits, and comments. But one thing is certain, that everyone saw a large increase in participation, which is a very good thing. But again, there's still low participation from LEP populations. So based on the VDOT district survey, what we wanted to do is we wanted to look pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. So pre-pandemic, average number of persons per year, this is by district, most of them were 5 or less. So this is, again, pre-pandemic. Average in-person attendance per meeting, the blue bar is the low, it's a range, so blue is low, orange is high. So as you can see, roughly maybe 30 people on average attended these meetings. And again, that could be high for a lot of districts, but that's essentially the average that we were seeing. Demographics, 6 said they did collect demographic data. And cost per meeting, what we said, again, the range being low to high, average is about $3,000 per meeting. And this is all the materials you have to put together, the staff time, and advertising. Newspaper ads are very expensive. So satisfaction rating was a little bit lukewarm across districts. Basically what we found is that, a lot of districts were kind of disappointed with participation numbers. So this was the satisfaction rating, 1 being not satisfied to 5 being highly satisfied. So during the pandemic, number of virtual engagement initiatives, as you can see, it bumped up quite a bit. So 5 districts had between 5 to 10 initiatives, and a couple districts had more than 20. Methods used, basically online surveys were the most common methods used. And then the primary platform, as I mentioned, MetroQuest was the most, we procured that, so most districts used MetroQuest. And the satisfaction rating across districts was much higher, from high to very high. And the main point with this was that there's much larger participation. So additional input, demographics, everyone said they collected demographic information, but I will show you another slide that shows that it was a little bit spotty. Language resources, 6 districts collected language, have language resources. Advertising, most of it was done on Facebook. The cost was $200, so compare that to the $3,000 cost in person. And then the future of public engagement is hybrid. So I know I have just a couple minutes left. My watch actually was not working. So VDOT, I want to blame it on my watch. So the data that we're collecting, basically we have VDOT has a MetroQuest survey tracking tool that gets information on participation, device access, and comments. So we took that data and we divided it into study type, district, and language. And then we also looked at a subset of data, which was actually about 1.5 years worth of data. And we looked at, basically delved into the participant data and outreach mechanisms. So number of surveys, this is across districts. And again, this is everything with MetroQuest. Northern Virginia had the most surveys at 19, Salem had the least at 6, but you see the representation across districts of the number of surveys that were given to the public. Non-English surveys, Northern Virginia produced 12, and that makes sense because of that LEP population in that district. Culpeper and Stanton also developed non-English surveys. So the most prolific study types were corridor type studies, project pipeline studies, and STAR studies. And then the average visitor participants per study type, what we found is the bike ped trail surveys. This is average. So we're looking at over almost 5,000 people on average submitted comments on a survey or actually participated in the survey. So the blue bar represents visitors. So that is actually somebody that will click on a link but not finish the survey. The red bar indicates the ones that actually went into the survey and completed the survey. So this is what the bike ped trails were the most highly participated surveys. English, non-English versions. This is a ratio of visitors to participants. As you can see, about half of the English participants completed the survey. And then we have roughly, less than 10% of non-English actually completed the survey if they visited the link. Device access, mostly what we found is that mobile was the highest in terms of device access, except for, I think it was Salem and the Culpeper district where non-mobile devices were used more frequently to access the survey. And then in terms of device access, we looked at English versus non-English. I thought this was interesting where the English, mostly people are accessing with a mobile device, where non-English, they're using a desktop or some other non-mobile device. Participant data. So this is again what I was talking about. This is all the data that we're collecting in the surveys. As you can see, browser, platform, and zip code. I mean, they are typically collected all the time. But what I wanted to point out was the demographic data. So this is percent of total surveys. And what we found is that only about 20% of the surveys actually collected demographic information. So it's very, very spotty. And those that did collect, we found that race, age, and gender were the most collected. And we also looked at MPO and PDC surveys, and they had much higher percentage of total surveys where they did collect demographic information, with race, age, and gender again being the most popular ones. So zip code data, just a quick example of what we can do with zip code data. What we can see on the left is all the areas represented by a MetroQuest survey where people actually submitted comments or participated. And then the figure on the right, B, is the density of those participants. So as you can see, it's mostly in more urban areas where the highest density is. So other mapping, what we can do with zip code data is we can look at comments and then do GIS mapping on those comments. So what we see here, this is the Lynchburg district. This was a safety study. So the bright blue represents areas where the most comments were found. So you can look at this type of data and do an analysis on that. And then lastly, marketing. As you can see, Facebook was the primary means for people to where they heard about the survey. So Facebook is where, as opposed to hearing from a friend or Twitter, I was surprised that Twitter was only 3%, but Facebook dominated in terms of how did you hear about the survey. And then our conclusions are that the benefits of virtual public engagement are widely acknowledged. But again, this is in terms of participation. And then challenges do exist, especially with reaching underserved populations. But there are avenues that exist to improve this participation, but it does create work. I mean, we have to go out and do the work. And then finally, hybrid will be the future. So, all right, 12:30. There are two recommendations. One is that we should update our public involvement manual to include data collection guidance. And this is just an example of one of the things I put together. We might see this in the updated version in some form, but this is what was presented to the Research Advisory Committee, where we all the districts should collect data pre-engagement. So this is, did you perform a demographic analysis? And what were the results of that analysis? What outreach methods did you use? And was there other language outreach methods used? So again, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. And then during engagement, you also want to collect information on the number of days that the survey was open, number of marketing campaigns that you used, because what we found is we can look at the marketing, you can look at the charts of participation, and what you can see are these bumps, and those are little bumps are where marketing campaigns existed. And then finally, post engagement. Let's collect some data on post engagement. And then the last recommendation was we need guidance on hybrid virtual meet or hybrid public engagement. So this would be in person and virtual. And what with this NCHRP report that's coming out, we should follow that, look to see what their guidance is, and then maybe develop our guidance based on those results. So that was our project in a nutshell. Sorry, it was so quick, but I had to get it in. I guess looks like it's 12:31. So, but if you have any questions, please reach out. If anybody wants a copy of the report, reach out to me. It is available online. And yeah, that's the presentation.
So I'm using this mic for the virtual audience. So if we want to take, I don't want to cut into the other speaker's time, but if we have anyone who has maybe 2 questions, I can bring the mic over to you. If anyone's in the virtual audience who wants to type something in the chat. I'll make a quick comment that you said something, I think, in your recommendation. So I am active in Girl Scouts, and they have a required annual meeting every year for the council. Probably every nonprofit does.
Yeah.
And they switched to virtual, and they had to update their bylaws because it was like written as like a meeting with a certain number of attendants and outreach in a certain format. So they rewrote it to be a little vaguer and to specifically say electronic means, like for something that comes down the pike 5 years from now that we don't even know. So that's kind of important. I mean, when you have rules about what you have to do to gather, you have to make sure that your gathering format is allowed to meet those rules.
Right. And I think the main takeaway that we're getting is that virtual public engagement, we're seeing such a higher percent. I mean, so many more people are participating. I mean, it's easy, it's accessible, but there's improvement that needs to be done, you know, especially with reaching underserved populations. So that was the major takeaway we got. And that's similar to the public hearings where, you know, there are certain laws that you have to have them in person. I mean, they had to change those laws because, I mean, you know, we weren't meeting. But yeah, it's still we're gonna find challenges. We're still learning about this, but I think again, the hybrid environment is what we're going to be. It's going to be around now forever, and I think you know we'll have a lot more participation from the public in that world.
Anyone else? Taryn, do we have anyone virtually who has something in the chat?
Nothing yet.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
I will introduce the next speakers. Do you want to set it up while I introduce you? That's probably a little more efficient since we want to be close on time. So our next topic is improving ridership projections and transit projects. We have 2 speakers. We have Peter Ohlms, who we will not bother while he's doing this, but Peter's a senior researcher at FC. He holds a master's in regional planning, Capitol Hill, and a civil engineering. His current and recent research has called multimodal innovation, transit ridership projections, prioritization practices for curb ramps, road diets, bike boxes, statewide bicycle pedestrian count, and pedestrian bicycle alert system for buses. And then he is presenting with she's a graduate student at UVA in civil engineering. She also has research experience and her research interests are in integrated multimodal transportation and public transit. So I will let them.
Cool. Thank you, Karen. And thank you for the lunch. I'm Peter Ohlms. I'm just basically going to introduce Afrida, who's a graduate student with us. I've been at VTRC for about 11 years, also, as Lance said, in the planning area. We did this study for the Department of Rail and Public Transportation. They were, of course, the most interested in transit things. They're a separate agency from VDOT. Most states don't have it that way, but Virginia has VDOT and the Department of Rail and Public Transportation, DRPT. So we thank Taylor Jenkins and Randy Selleck there and other folks at transit agencies who helped us out with some data collection. But I'm going to let Afrida do most of the talking. I'll come up in the middle and give her a break, and then she'll finish out.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone. So Right. So the topic, as we said earlier, is improving transit ridership projections. But we need to understand why these matter and why we need to be improving them in the first place, right? So transit ridership data is widely used in many cases. It is a performance metric that's looked at by different agencies when they're prioritizing different projects. Like in this case, DRPT looks at transit ridership when they're selecting which projects they want to fund. It's also used in different state and federal funding formulas. So this determines how much funding each transit agency receives. And other than that, it's also used in planning and operations research. So for example, if a planner wants to estimate how many bus riders a particular road might have, they would need transit ridership estimates. So despite being this really important piece of data, it's actually really challenging to obtain directly from transit agencies because they all have different ways of storing and collecting this data. So it's very non-standardized and difficult to work with at that point, but it is very easily accessible from crowdsourced big data platforms like Streetlight, which we will be talking about a little bit later. So that's one option for us too. We had three main research questions in this project. The first was we wanted to understand how ridership is affected when you're improving basic stop infrastructure by, for example, adding a bus shelter, by making the stops ADA compliant, by adding landing pads, and so on. The second research question was we wanted to determine how much of the daily ridership was occurring during the buses or rail's busiest hours. So for example, if 100 people got on the bus during the day, which hour had the busiest occupancy of the bus? And third, we wanted to explore and evaluate how accurate the data from these crowdsourced data platforms are compared to ridership data from transit agencies. The scope of our data mostly covered pre-pandemic data because as you can see over here, there was a huge drop in ridership when the pandemic hit because most people refused to use transit then. So we only focused on 2019 data, which was pre-pandemic, and the modes we focused on were fixed route buses. These are, in case of Charlottesville, like the Charlottesville Area Transit. For heavy rail, we focused on Metro Rail in Virginia, and for commuter rail, it's the VRE or Virginia Railway Express. So the first case study we had where we looked at the effects of stop improvements on bus ridership, we initially did a literature search and examined how the ridership changes varied across different states or different countries, and there were a range of different increases in response to the stop improvements. What we did was we carried out a before and after study using data from Arlington Transit. So Arlington Transit made a couple of stop improvements to their bus stops back in 2018. So we collected their ridership data from 2017, which was the before period, and then 2019's data, which was the after period. So the improvements they mostly did were adding landing pads, as you can see here, to make them ADA compliant. They also added some lean bars so that passengers can lean on them as they wait for their bus. They replaced their shelters with solar powered shelters, and they also added benches in a few of their stops. The data that we collected from them could be broadly divided into two groups. One, the treated stops, which experienced these improvements, and the others were the control stops, which experienced no changes whatsoever during the same time period. So this map shows you the locations of the treated stops, which are the blue circles, and the control stops, which are the red squares. The data we received from the Arlington Transit was pretty, it had some missing data. So we had to remove some stops and made sure that the pre-improvement ridership was comparable for growth groups. And then we calculated the ridership changes that occurred over time for each of their groups. We compared the mean ridership changes of the treated group with the control group. And we also used some statistical tests to determine their significance. We found that there was a 177% increase in ridership when these stop amenities were being improved, and it was statistically significant. The control group also saw an increase, but it was very small, 27%, and it was not statistically significant. Overall, the stop level ridership growth for the treated group was 233% higher than that for the control group. The second case study, which was looking at the proportion of daily transit riders during peak hours, over here for the bus ridership data, we reached out to 4 different transit agencies in Virginia. And over here, the map shows you the location of these transit agencies. So the blue and pink dots that you're seeing on the left belong to Blacksburg Transit and Radford Transit. Blacksburg Transit has a significantly larger student population that it serves, so the blue dot that you're seeing is larger. The dots over here all are corresponding to relative ridership levels. Radford Transit has a smaller student population to serve, so it's much smaller. And the red dot that you're seeing belongs to Bay Transit, which serves Northern Neck region, and it serves like mostly a multi-county rural region with limited operating hours. So it had the smallest ridership out of all the transit agencies here. The green dot is Dash, which serves the city of Alexandria, which has a relatively high ridership level. Again, all of this data was pre-pandemic. We collected 2 months of data, either April and May or September and October, and we only focused on weekday data. The results showed that we constructed graphs to see how the ridership was varying throughout the day. So the percentage over here, you can see that this was 30% at 9 a.m. This 30% is of the daily ridership level. So for one day, 30% was occurring during 9 a.m. for Bay Transit. And for Dash, which serves more of an urban area, they had peaks during typical traffic commute hours. So when people are going to work or when they're coming back from work, that's when their ridership is peaking. And this 10% is of the daily ridership level for those hours. For the two college towns that we looked at, Blacksburg Transit and Radford Transit, they do not have peaks during typical traffic commute hours because students don't have the same travel behavior. But their percentages also agreed with what we saw with Dash. They ranged from 10 to 11% of daily ridership. For Metro Rail, these dots again correspond to relative ridership levels, and we chose 6 stations of WMATA that are located in Northern Virginia to study in this case. And over here, Courthouse Station had the highest ridership, whereas Spring Hill Station had the lowest ridership of all the stations we looked at. This graph shows you how the hourly variation of ridership for Courthouse Station varied throughout the day. These, for all 6 stations, these ridership varied from 14% to 26%. For VRE, or commuter rail, we did the same thing. These also show you the locations of the 6 stations that we studied. And this was the graph we got from Leland Road Station. As you may know, commuter VRE does not operate throughout the day like Metro Rail does. It only operates during when people are commuting to and from work. So they had a much higher peak that ranged from about 37% to 56%, which was much higher than what we saw from Metro Rail. So this is the third part of our study, and Peter will first be providing us with an overview of what streetlight is.
So up to this point, we've been talking about data we got from transit agencies. Streetlight is not what you have on a pole that illuminates the ground. In this case, where you have the L capitalized in the middle, it's a software platform. Software as a service just means you get to it online. You have to pay a subscription fee. And it uses big data, which means they bring together a whole bunch of data sources, and they'd use machine learning on that, meaning they let the computer figure out what all those data sources are telling them, what the outcome is. So we found that learning about streetlight is evolving because streetlight itself is always evolving, but it offers data on various modes, and the modes include bus and rail, and the data include this transit activity data source that I'll talk about on the next slide. VDOT has a subscription to this tool, and it can cover some other agencies, including metropolitan planning organizations and planning districts. But I believe it does not cover local agencies or transit agencies unless they are working on a project for VDOT or for the Commonwealth. So you can buy your own subscription, or you can find out if you are able to use VDOT's. The way this tool works, as I said, is always changing, but how it worked when we did our study is that they bring in a bunch of data. So anybody using a phone, you're generating a location ping, and they bring in those kinds of data, but other data as well. And an algorithm figures out what those pings that are moving are probably traveling on. Are they cars? Are they on a bus or something like that? And that algorithm gets trained using map layers from OpenStreetMap. That's something that might have things like bus routes in it. And then it's validated using a couple of transit agencies' ridership data from across the country and information from things like the National Household Travel Survey. As an example of how Streetlight is changing, just this morning we got an announcement that you can now click on a bus line in Streetlight, which was not the case when we did it. So what Afrida's going to talk about is the way we had to go around looking at all these bus stops and making buffers of them. But that, that's interesting. But the product that they offer is still the same as it was when we looked at it. It's a relative index that represents transit ridership activity levels. It's not actual ridership counts. It's not necessarily estimates. It can be used to compare within Streetlight relatively. Back to you.
Thanks, Peter. So yeah, like he said, I'll be explaining what exactly we did to analyze the data. As mentioned earlier, Blacksburg Transit and Dash had the highest ridership levels among the 4 transit agencies we studied in Virginia. So those were the only 2 agencies we could actually work with in Streetlight. So for those 2 agencies, Dash and Blacksburg Transit, we collected their general transit feed specification files, which had the locations of all their bus stops. And we imported them into ArcGIS Pro, where we created like these little buffers of 50-meter radii around them, which is what Streetlight recommends. So these buffers are essentially there to capture the pings of the smartphones that you carry. And then we ran 3 types of Streetlight analysis. The first was we analyzed the bus activity levels within the city boundary, county, or city boundary limits. So for example, for Dash, we analyzed all bus activity level within the city of Alexandria. Second type of analysis was run using this map that you're seeing, but using a period of 2 months. The third analysis was using this map again, but with a period of 4 months. And then we compared these results with the results from the previous case study where we collected the data from the transit agencies themselves. The results for Dash, you can see here, the ground truth data, the transit agency data is the blue line, and the dashed lines are the Streetlight results that we got. So they're represented pretty well. And the values that you're seeing here, the root mean square error values, the lower the value, the better the results. So in this case, the lowest value belonged to when you analyzed with 4 months of data using the map that we created ourselves. For Blacksburg Transit, this was a lot worse. You can see that the map is like, the graphs are all over the place. They don't match the ground truth data at all. And the errors are overall much higher than what we just saw with Dash. But in this case as well, the best analysis was when you did it with the map with 4 months of data. For rail activity data, it was a lot easier because Streetlight already had the stations on their website. You just had to select the stations you want to work with. We analyzed the trips that were starting at each station just to get an idea of the boardings, and we did this for all 4 months of data at the time that they had available. Again, we compared this with the data that we collected from the transit agency. So over here, we just have 2 graphs of the 6 graphs that we analyzed. McLean Station is the best one that we had from Streetlight. They had the lowest amount of error among all 6 stations. Courthouse Station had the highest error because you can see that the graphs don't really match up well over here. And we think that it's possibly because Courthouse Station is located below street level, so the pings from people's smartphones might not be getting through to the cell towers as much. For commuter rail or VRE, this was Rolling Road Station and Backlick Road Station, again, the best and the worst in terms of errors. And overall, VRE had much higher errors than we saw with Metro Rail. And we think that this is possibly because VRE currently does not have a good way of accounting for people's boardings the way Metro Rail does. So it's possible that the ground truth data we're considering isn't exactly perfect. Now, finally, the conclusions. For the first case study, we improved or got a better understanding of how ridership is changing when you're improving bus stops by adding shelters and so on. So improved ridership estimates like these can enable better decision-making, can enable better funding allocations. We found statistically significant ridership increases after bus stops were improved in Arlington, and these increases align with what we saw in the literature. But we need to view these with caution because it is possible that these ridership changes can be happening due to other reasons as well. So for example, if during the same time period, a new apartment complex was built near the bus stop, it's possible that people started going to that bus stop because of that apartment complex. So future research should be done using more transit agencies in a mix of urban and rural areas. For the second study, we found that a higher proportion of daily passengers were riding rail during peak hours than they were for bus. College town bus ridership does not peak during typical traffic commuter hours, as we saw earlier. We did not look at commuter route buses, so future research could be done if transit agencies have adequate hourly ridership data available. Finally, the third study that we did, we found that a transit agency's annual ridership figure is able to indicate whether using Streetlight is worth it. However, it does not necessarily mean that the higher the ridership, the more accurate the results would be, because in this study, Blacksburg Transit had the highest ridership but did not have the most accurate results. So future research should utilize more months of data in Streetlight and see how they compare. Thank you.
You have questions? Nobody wants to use a microphone. It's kind of a powerful feeling. You should give it a try. Any questions? Taryn, anyone in the remote audience can unmute or add something to the chat, whichever they prefer. No pressure, but there's more of you out there virtually. Oh, that's all.
I think that's mostly Taryn posting.
She posted the
information.
bios because that was a little hard to hear. Yeah, so if you scroll past the bio, at the end, past the bios, there might be.
Yeah, Karen, I'm not seeing any questions yet.
Thank you for thinking to check, Peter.
Lance, you're not allowed to ask questions.
Lance, I'm going to bring this over to you for the virtual audience.
No, the question I wanted to ask is what do you see in Streetlight coming forward? You know, do you see like in terms of transit ridership, collecting data, both ped, bike, you know, things like that? How do you see Streetlight advancing the state of the art?
One thing that I didn't mention in the presentation, but which they've been talking about for about a year now, is that their data sources have changed kind of because of what's happening in my pocket. My phone and your phone are now allowing me to say, I don't want to share my location with this app or that app. And the amount of pings from that data source has gone way, way down. And so they're then having to rely on other data sources that work sometimes for things like cars or delivery vehicles because you have your GPS in the car, but maybe aren't working as well for this kind of transit mode imputation. So continued attempts at modeling that and maybe bringing in new data sources seem to be the way of the future, but that means there's a continued need to figure out how accurate that is. Not necessarily a clear answer.
Anything else? All right, last call for virtual. Anything else? Okay, nobody unmuted. All right, then thank you so much. And thank you everyone to our speakers. A round of applause for all three of them. And thank you to everyone for attending this first event. I do actually have evaluations for the virtual audience. I think we'll email those to you. I didn't think of that till this second, but this gives us a little chance to get some feedback before we have additional meetings, and it's quick and easy. So thank you.